Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are the ones that bring us home to what we've lost. There are moments when life gives us a second chance we never saw coming, wrapped in circumstances we'd never expect. Jake Morrison was dying alone in the Colorado mountains, far from anyone who might care. The poison in his veins was winning, and the legendary mountain man who had survived countless dangers was finally meeting his match. Then a young girl found him by the frozen creek. She didn't know his reputation or his past. She just saw a man who needed help and decided to save him. As she nursed him back to health in her small cabin, Jake began to see something familiar in her eyes and the way she moved. What he discovered would change everything he thought he knew about family, loss, and the power of love to heal old wounds. Could this stranger who saved his life actually be the daughter he never knew he had? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Colorado Territory, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. In these untamed mountains, where the air was thin and unforgiving, few men dared to call the wilderness home. But Jake Morrison wasn't just any man. For 15 years, he had carved out an existence in places where civilization feared to tread, earning a reputation that stretched from Denver to the mining camps of Leadville. At 42, Jake possessed the kind of presence that made other men step aside without understanding why. His weathered face told stories of harsh winters and dangerous encounters, while his dark eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had seen too much and survived it all. Standing just over 6 feet tall, his frame carried the lean muscle of a man who lived by his wits and his strength. His hands, scarred from countless encounters with wild animals and rougher men, could track a deer through fresh snow or draw a colt faster than most men could blink. The cabin Jake called home sat nestled in a valley so remote that most maps didn't acknowledge its existence. He had built it himself, log by careful log, positioning it where the morning sun would warm the walls and the evening shadows would hide it from prying eyes. Inside, the single room was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized. His rifle hung above the stone fireplace within easy reach. Shelves lined one wall, holding supplies that could sustain him through the longest winter. A simple wooden table sat beneath the single window, where he cleaned his weapons and planned his routes through the mountain passes. Jake's reputation preceded him in every settlement within 100 miles. Traders spoke of him in hushed tones, describing a man who could appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Some called him a ghost, others a legend. The truth was simpler and more complex than the stories. Jake Morrison was a man who had chosen solitude not from hatred of humanity, but from a deep understanding that some lives were meant to be lived apart from others. He made his living as a guide and tracker, helping lost travelers find their way or leading hunting parties to game that lesser men couldn't locate. When winter storms trapped settlers in their cabins, Jake appeared with supplies and medical knowledge gleaned from years of treating his own injuries. He asked for little in return, preferring payment in ammunition, coffee, or books rather than coin. The few who knew him well understood that beneath his gruff exterior lived a man of unshakable honor. But on this particular morning, Jake Morrison was not in his familiar cabin. Instead, he lay unconscious on a narrow bed in a much smaller dwelling, his powerful frame looking oddly vulnerable beneath a patchwork quilt. The poison that had nearly killed him 3 days earlier was finally loosening its grip on his system, allowing his natural strength to reassert itself. His breathing had steadied during the night, and the deadly pallor was beginning to fade from his weathered features. Emma Whitfield moved quietly around the small cabin, tending to her unexpected patient with the same careful attention she gave to the injured animals she occasionally rescued. At 16, she possessed a maturity that spoke of too many years spent caring for herself in an unforgiving world. Her auburn hair, inherited from a mother she barely remembered, caught the firelight as she checked Jake's temperature with the back of her small hand. Her green eyes, bright with intelligence and compassion, reflected a strength that belied her youth. Emma's cabin was even more modest than Jake's, consisting of a single room with a sleeping loft accessed by a wooden ladder. She had made it her own over the past 2 years, since the fever had taken the elderly woman who had raised her after her mother's death. Hand-sewn curtains softened the single window, and dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the space with the scent of sage and lavender. A small collection of books, her most precious possessions, occupied a place of honor on a shelf near her bed. The girl had found Jake 3 mornings earlier, collapsed beside Willow Creek, with frost forming on his beard and his lips already blue from cold. Most 16-year-olds would have fled from such a fearsome-looking stranger, but Emma had recognized the signs of poisoning immediately. Her mother, Sarah, had been skilled with herbs and healing, and Emma had inherited both the knowledge and the calling to help those in need. Working with strength born of desperation, Emma had managed to drag Jake's considerable bulk onto a travois she hastily constructed from pine branches and rope. The journey to her cabin, less than a mile but feeling like 10 with such a burden, had taken her the better part of the day. Once there, she had immediately begun treating him with charcoal and herbs to counteract the poison, forcing the mixtures down his throat even when he was too unconscious to swallow properly. Now, as Jake stirred for the first time in 3 days, Emma felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had saved his life, but she knew nothing about this man beyond his reputation. Stories reached even her remote corner of the mountains, tales of Jake Morrison's skill and his dangerous past. Some said he had been a soldier once, others claimed he was running from the law. Emma had learned not to put too much faith in mountain gossip, but she remained cautious. Jake's eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding his vision as he tried to focus on his surroundings. The ceiling above him was rough-hewn timber, not the familiar beams of his own cabin. The scent in the air was different too, feminine somehow, with hints of lavender and something else he couldn't identify. His throat felt raw, and his body ached as if he had been trampled by horses. "Easy now," Emma said softly, moving into his line of sight. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. The poison nearly killed you." Jake tried to speak, but managed only a hoarse croak. Emma immediately moved to a small table and returned with a cup of water, supporting his head while he drank. The cool liquid soothed his parched throat, and after a few moments he found his voice. "Where am I?" he asked, his words barely above a whisper. "My cabin," Emma replied, settling back into the chair beside his bed. "I found you by Willow Creek. Someone tried to kill you with poison, but I think the worst has passed now." Jake studied the young woman before him, taking in her direct gaze and confident manner. She was small but clearly capable, and there was something about her that seemed familiar, though he couldn't place what it might be. Her face was heart-shaped and delicate, but her hands showed the calluses of someone accustomed to hard work. "You saved my life," Jake said, the words carrying more weight than simple gratitude. Emma nodded matter-of-factly. "Mother always said that healing was a gift that should be shared freely. You would have done the same for anyone you found dying in the snow." The mention of her mother stirred something in Jake's memory, but his thoughts were still clouded from the poison's effects. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted the decision as the room spun around him. "Not so fast," Emma cautioned, gently pressing him back against the pillows. "Your body is still recovering. You need rest and nourishment before you try to move around." Over the following hours, as Emma fed him broth and herbal tea, Jake found himself studying his young rescuer with growing curiosity. There was an old soul quality about her that reminded him of someone, though the memory remained frustratingly elusive. She moved with quiet efficiency around the small cabin, clearly comfortable in her solitude, but equally at ease, caring for another person. "What's your name?" Jake asked during one of his more alert moments. "Emma Whitfield," she replied, adding another log to the fire. "And you're Jake Morrison. Even out here people know that name." Jake nodded slowly, unsurprised that his reputation had preceded him even to this remote place. "What do they say about me?" Emma considered the question carefully before answering. "That you're dangerous but honorable. That you help people when they need it, but don't suffer fools gladly. That you know these mountains better than any man alive. And what do you think? I think, Emma said, meeting his gaze directly, that someone who lives alone in the wilderness for so many years is either running from something or protecting others from something about himself. I also think that despite your fearsome reputation, you have kind eyes. The simple honesty of her words caught Jake off guard. Most people either feared him or wanted something from him. Emma seemed to see him simply as a man who had needed help and was now recovering from a close brush with death. As the day progressed, Jake found himself sharing more than he had intended. Emma had a way of asking questions that invited rather than demanded answers. She learned that he had built his reputation through 15 years of honest work, that he valued his privacy above almost everything else, and that he had no family to speak of. For her part, Emma revealed that she had lived in these mountains all her life, first with her mother until age 4, then with an elderly woman named Ruth, who had taken them in when Sarah Whitfield had died of consumption. Ruth had passed 2 years earlier, leaving Emma to fend for herself in the wilderness. She made her living through a combination of trapping, herb gathering, and occasional work for passing travelers who needed supplies or directions. What struck Jake most forcefully about Emma was her complete lack of self-pity despite the hardships she had endured. She spoke of her losses matter-of-factly as natural parts of life that had shaped but not broken her. There was a resilience about her that reminded him of the strongest people he had known, those who had faced adversity and emerged not bitter but wise. As evening approached and Emma prepared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread, Jake found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt in many years, a sense of belonging. The warmth of the cabin, the gentle sounds of domestic activity, the presence of another human being who asked nothing from him beyond the courtesy of honest conversation, all of it combined to create an atmosphere of peace he had almost forgotten could exist. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up, promising another cold night in the mountains. But inside Emma's small cabin, Jake Morrison felt safer and more cared for than he had in decades. He still didn't know who had tried to poison him or why, but for the first time since awakening, that seemed like a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, he was content to be alive, to be warm, and to be in the company of the remarkable young woman who had saved his life. By his 4th morning in Emma's cabin, Jake had regained enough strength to sit at her small wooden table and take solid food. The color had returned to his weathered face, and his hands no longer trembled when he reached for his coffee cup. Emma moved about her morning routine with quiet efficiency, but Jake could sense a tension in her movements that hadn't been there the day before. "Something's troubling you," Jake observed, his voice stronger now, though still carrying the rasp of his recent ordeal. Emma paused in her task of kneading bread dough, her small hands stilling on the wooden surface. "I rode to Miller's trading post yesterday while you were sleeping," she said without looking up. "Needed supplies, and I wanted to ask if anyone knew what kind of poison had been used on you." Jake set down his cup carefully. "And old Pete Miller was acting strange, nervous-like, when I described what I'd found and asked about poisons. He kept looking over his shoulder and wouldn't meet my eyes." Emma finally turned to face him, concern evident in her green eyes. "He said 3 men had been through 2 days earlier, asking questions about you, specifically about whether anyone had seen you recently and where you might be holed up for the winter." The coffee turned bitter in Jake's mouth. After 15 years of careful living, of avoiding the mistakes that had nearly destroyed him in his youth, his past had finally caught up with him. Did Pete describe these men? One was tall and well-dressed, like he had money. City clothes, not mountain gear. The other 2 looked like hired guns. Emma wiped flour from her hands with deliberate movements. "Pete said the well-dressed one offered good money for information about your whereabouts. When Pete claimed he hadn't seen you in months, the man got angry." Jake pushed back from the table and walked to the single window, though the effort still cost him. Outside, the morning was bright and deceptively peaceful, with fresh snow covering the pine boughs like nature's own lace. But he wasn't seeing the beauty anymore. He was calculating angles of approach, defensive positions, escape routes. The poison wasn't random, he said, more to himself than to Emma. Someone knew I'd be at Miller's trading post that day. Knew I always ordered the same meal when I was there. You think Pete... No. Jake shook his head firmly. Pete Miller's been straight with me for 10 years. If he wanted me dead, he's had plenty of easier opportunities. But someone got to that stew before I did, and they knew exactly what would put me down without killing me immediately. Emma joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. Why would they want you unconscious instead of dead? Because a dead man can't answer questions. Jake's voice carried the weight of hard experience. They wanted me alive long enough to tell them something. When the poison took longer to work than expected and I managed to get away from the trading post, they probably figured I'd crawled off somewhere to die. But what could they want to know? Jake was quiet for a long moment, memories surfacing that he'd spent years trying to bury. I wasn't always a mountain man, Emma. Before I came to these peaks, I was involved in things that some people might want to forget, or make sure stayed forgotten. From her apron pocket, Emma pulled a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and wear. I found this tacked to a tree about a mile from where I discovered you. Must have blown loose in the wind. Jake unfolded the paper carefully, his expression growing grim as he read. It was a wanted poster, dated 20 years earlier, bearing a crude but recognizable drawing of his younger face. The text beneath offered a substantial reward for information leading to the capture of Jake Morrison, wanted for murder and robbery in the Colorado Territory. This isn't true, Jake said quietly, his finger tracing the faded ink. I never murdered anyone who didn't have it coming, and I never stole anything that wasn't already stolen from someone else. But there are people who would prefer the real story never came to light. Emma studied the poster with the same careful attention she'd given to his injuries. Someone's been carrying this for 20 years? Or had it printed fresh from old records? Jake folded the paper and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Either way, it means whoever poisoned me isn't just settling an old score. They're afraid of something I know. The implications settled between them like a physical weight. Emma returned to her bread-making, but her movements had become mechanical, distracted. Jake could see the wheels turning in her mind as she processed what this meant for both of them. You need to leave, she said finally, not looking up from her work. Yes, where will you go? Jake considered the question. His cabin would be the first place they'd look, and most of the mountain passes he knew could be watched or blocked. I have a few places I can disappear for a while. Winter hideouts that nobody knows about. What about your regular life? Your guiding work? That's over now. The finality in his voice surprised them both. Whoever these people are, they've got resources and patience. They've been hunting me for 20 years without giving up. I can't put innocent people at risk by maintaining my old contacts. Emma shaped the bread dough into loaves with precise movements, but Jake could see her hands shaking slightly. What if they come here looking for you? They might. Pete Miller's honest, but he's not stupid. If they press him hard enough, he'll eventually admit he saw you asking questions about poison. It wouldn't be hard to track you back here. Then I should come with you. The words hung in the air between them, surprising them both with their certainty. Jake turned to stare at Emma, seeing not the capable young woman who had saved his life, but suddenly aware of how young 16 really was. Absolutely not. These are dangerous men, Emma. The kind who wouldn't hesitate to hurt a young girl to get information. And what makes you think I'd be safer here alone? Emma's voice carried a steel that reminded Jake of someone, though he couldn't place who. If they do come looking and find me here, what's to stop them from assuming I know where you've gone? At least if I'm with you, I'd have a chance to defend myself. You saved my life. I won't repay that kindness by putting you in danger. Emma set down her bread and faced him squarely. Mr. Morrison, I've been taking care of myself in this wilderness for 2 years. Before that, I was helping Ruth with her trap lines and herb gathering since I was tall enough to reach the snares. I'm not some helpless town girl who faints at the sight of blood. Jake studied her determined expression and recognized something he'd seen in his own mirror many times over the years. The look of someone who had already made their decision and wouldn't be swayed by logic or concern. Besides, Emma continued, returning to her bread with renewed purpose, you're still not fully recovered from the poisoning. Your hands shake when you think I'm not watching, and you get winded walking across the room. You need more time to regain your strength, and you need someone to watch your back while you're vulnerable. The truth of her words stung, partly because Jake prided himself on never needing anyone's help, and partly because she was absolutely right. The poison had taken more out of him than he'd wanted to admit, and traveling alone in his current condition would be dangerous even without the threat of pursuit. If you come with me, Jake said slowly, it won't be like the life you've known here. We'll be moving constantly, sleeping cold, eating whatever we can find or catch. And if we're found by the wrong people, there won't be any mercy for either of us. I understand the risks. Do you? Really? Jake's voice carried the weight of hard experience. Because once we leave this cabin together, there's no going back to the way things were. Your life here, your independence, your safety, all of that ends the moment you choose to help me. Emma met his gaze without flinching. My mother used to say that some choices make themselves, that when the moment comes, you either step forward or step back, and either way, you have to live with the consequences. She brushed flour from her hands and began banking the fire. I'm stepping forward. Mr. Morrison, the question is whether you're going to let pride stop you from accepting help from someone who's already proven. She can keep you alive. Jake stared at this remarkable young woman who had saved his life and was now offering to risk her own for his sake. There was something about her certainty, her fearless determination, that stirred memories he couldn't quite grasp. But looking into her green eyes, bright with intelligence and resolve, he found himself nodding slowly. We leave at first light, he said. And Emma, if we're going to be traveling together, you'd better start calling me Jake. For the first time since she'd shown him the wanted poster, Emma smiled. Jake it is. Now let me teach you how to pack for a long journey in winter. Something tells me you're going to need every advantage we can manage. The first snowflakes of evening were beginning to fall when Emma carefully placed her mother's journal into her leather satchel. The worn, leather-bound book was one of her most precious possessions, filled with Sarah Whitfield's thoughts, recipes, and memories from a life that had ended too soon. Emma had read every page dozens of times, treasuring the connection to the mother she barely remembered. Jake watched her pack with the methodical efficiency of someone who had lived with uncertainty for years. Each item she selected served multiple purposes. The thick woolen blanket that could also serve as a shelter, the small iron pot that could cook food or melt snow, the collection of herbs that could heal wounds or settle a troubled stomach. Tell me about your mother, Jake said, settling into the chair beside the fire. His strength was returning, but he was still conserving his energy for the journey ahead. Emma paused in her packing, her hands resting on the journal's worn cover. Her name was Sarah Whitfield, though I sometimes wondered if that was really her name. Ruth used to say that Mother arrived in these mountains with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a belly already showing her pregnancy. Jake's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. She was pregnant when she came here? With me, yes. I was born about 4 months after she arrived. Emma's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone she used when discussing difficult subjects. Ruth said Mother never spoke much about where she came from or who my father was, just that she'd loved him deeply and lost him to circumstances beyond their control. The cup trembled slightly in Jake's hands, though he told himself it was still weakness from the poison. Did she ever describe him? Emma opened the journal carefully, its pages soft with age and frequent handling. She wrote about him sometimes. Here, listen to this. She read aloud in her clear, steady voice. I dream of his hands still, so gentle despite all the violence they've seen. He had the strongest hands I've ever known, but when he touched my face, it was like being caressed by a whisper. Jake set down his cup before he could drop it. The description stirred something deep in his memory, not just the words, but the way Emma spoke them, with an inflection that sounded hauntingly familiar. She wrote a lot about hands, Emma continued, flipping through several pages. Look at this entry. I wish he could have known about our child. He would have been such a gentle father, patient and kind. His own childhood was stolen from him, but he had so much love to give. I see his eyes every time I look at our daughter. Your eyes, Jake said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Emma looked up, surprised. What? Your eyes? You said she saw his eyes in you. What color were they? His eyes? Dark brown, almost black, like looking into deep water at night. Emma studied Jake's face with growing curiosity. Why do you ask? Jake turned toward the fire, hoping the flickering light would hide his expression. His eyes were indeed dark brown, almost black, and more than one person over the years had commented on their intensity. Just curious about the man who left such an impression on her. Emma returned to the journal, but Jake could feel her watching him from the corner of her eye. She wrote about other things too. He was a soldier once, she said, before the war changed everything. And he was good with horses, could gentle the wildest stallion with patience and understanding. Every word hit Jake like a physical blow. He had served in the cavalry during the war, and his skill with horses was legendary throughout the territory. But thousands of men had served as cavalry soldiers, and many of them had learned to work with horses. It could be coincidence. Did she ever mention his name? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Sometimes she just called him Jay in her writing. But there's one entry. Emma flipped through several more pages, her finger tracing the faded ink. Here it is. I still wear the bracelet Jay made for me from silver he found in the creek. His hands were so careful with the delicate work, crafting something beautiful from raw metal. He said it was practice for the wedding ring he would make me someday. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He remembered that bracelet, remembered spending hours by a mountain stream, carefully hammering raw silver into delicate loops and curves. He'd been so proud of that piece, the first jewelry he'd ever attempted to make. He'd given it to Sarah the night before he left, promising to return with a ring that would make her his wife forever. Do you still have it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The bracelet? Emma smiled and pushed up the sleeve of her wool dress, revealing a delicate silver bracelet that caught the firelight. Mother made me promise to never take it off. She said it was made with more love than any piece of jewelry ever crafted. Jake stared at the bracelet, his vision blurring slightly. Every loop and curve was exactly as he remembered, though the silver had developed a patina that spoke of 20 years of constant wear. His hands began to shake again, and this time it had nothing to do with the poison. Are you all right? Emma asked, concern creeping into her voice. You look pale. I'm fine, Jake managed, though he was anything but fine. The room seemed to be spinning around him as the implications crashed over him like an avalanche. Just still weak from the poisoning, but Emma was studying him more intently now, her intelligent eyes noting details he couldn't hide. You know something about this bracelet, don't you? Jake stood abruptly and walked to the window, needing distance from the journal, the bracelet, and the growing certainty that was threatening to overwhelm him. Outside, the snow was falling heavier now, and the wind was beginning to pick up. They would need to leave soon, regardless of the weather. We should get some rest, he said without turning around. We have a long journey ahead of us. Emma was quiet for a moment, but Jake could feel her continued scrutiny. My mother wrote other things too, she said softly, about how Jay had to leave because dangerous men were after him, how he promised to come back for her once it was safe. Jake's reflection in the window showed a man who looked like he'd seen a ghost. What else did she write? That she waited for 2 years before she got word that he'd been killed. That's when she decided to come to these mountains, to raise their child in a place where his memory would be safe from the ugliness of the world that had taken him from her. The final piece fell into place with devastating clarity. Jake Morrison was supposed to be dead. Someone had made sure Sarah received that news, had driven her away from her home and into the wilderness where she'd spent the rest of her short life, believing the man she loved was gone forever. But he wasn't killed, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with certainty. Because if my mother's Jay had been killed 20 years ago, He couldn't be standing in my cabin right now, shaking like a leaf and trying to hide the fact that he recognizes every word I'm reading from her journal. Jake turned slowly, meeting Emma's gaze across the small room. In her green eyes, he saw intelligence, understanding, and something that might have been hope. "Hello, Father," Emma said quietly. The simple words broke something inside Jake's chest. Years of carefully constructed walls crumbling in an instant. He moved toward her on unsteady legs, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't shed in decades. "Emma," he whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch her face. "My God, Emma, you're my daughter." She leaned into his touch, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I wondered. From the moment I saw you by the creek, something felt familiar. And then today, watching you react to Mother's words." She smiled through her tears. "She used to say I had your stubborn chin." Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her close for the first time in her life, feeling the rightness of it settle into his bones. This remarkable young woman who had saved his life was his own daughter, Sarah's daughter, the child he'd never known existed. "I thought I'd lost everything," he murmured into her hair. "But Sarah left me the most precious gift I could ever have imagined." The silver bracelet caught the firelight as Emma pushed it higher on her wrist, the gesture unconscious but significant. Jake couldn't stop looking at it, remembering the hours he'd spent shaping each delicate curve by the creek behind Sarah's family home. He'd been so young then, barely 22 and full of dreams about the life they would build together. "I need to know everything," Jake said, settling into the chair across from Emma. "About your mother, about her life here, about how she died. And I need to tell you why I never came back for her." Emma nodded, understanding the weight of 20 years of separation couldn't be bridged with a simple embrace. She opened her mother's journal again, but this time her movements were different, reverent, as if she was sharing sacred text with the one person who could truly understand its meaning. "Mother wrote about you almost every day for the first year," Emma began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "She never stopped believing you'd come back. Even when the messenger brought word of your death, she refused to believe it completely." Jake leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. What exactly did this messenger tell her? That Jake Morrison had been killed in a shootout with law enforcement outside Denver. That his body had been burned in the fire that followed the gunfight. Emma's finger traced the edge of the journal's page. "But Mother wrote here that something about the story never felt right to her. She said you were too smart to get trapped like that, too careful to let yourself be cornered. She was right to doubt it," Jake said grimly. "I was never in Denver during that time. I was hiding in the Northern Territories, trying to stay ahead of the men who had framed me for a murder I didn't commit." Emma looked up sharply. "The wanted poster from yesterday? Part of a larger scheme. I stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see, and powerful people decided I needed to disappear permanently." Jake's voice carried the weight of old anger and fresher understanding. "They couldn't just kill me outright without raising questions, so they destroyed my reputation instead. Made me into a wanted man so that anyone who gave me shelter would be breaking the law. But why didn't you try to contact Mother after things settled down?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, the pain of old decisions etched clearly on his weathered face. "Because I believed they were right about one thing. As long as I was alive, Sarah would never be safe. The men hunting me had unlimited resources and no conscience. If they discovered our connection, they would have used her to get to me." Emma absorbed this, her intelligent eyes processing the implications. "So you chose to let her think you were dead, rather than risk her life." It seemed like the only choice that protected her. Jake's voice broke slightly. "I never knew she was pregnant, Emma. If I had known about you, you would have come anyway, despite the danger." In a heartbeat, Emma closed the journal and held it against her chest. She knew that. In her later entries after I was born, she wrote about how glad she was that you didn't know. She said you would have died trying to reach us, and then we both would have lost you for real. The practical wisdom of it didn't make the pain any less sharp. Jake had spent 20 years believing his sacrifice had kept Sarah safe, only to learn that she had died young anyway. alone, except for the kindness of strangers, and the daughter she'd raised with stories of a father who could never come home. "Tell me about her last days," Jake said quietly. Emma's composure wavered for the first time since their mutual recognition. "The consumption came on fast in the winter when I was 4. Ruth said Mother fought it hard, determined to see me old enough to remember her teachings. She lasted until spring, giving me everything she could about healing, about survival, about you. What did she tell you about me? That you were the strongest man she'd ever known, but gentle with those you loved. That you had honor even when the world tried to take it from you. That someday, if I was very lucky, I might meet someone who loved as deeply and truly as you had loved her." Emma smiled through her tears. "She used to say I had your stubborn streak and your way of seeing the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." Jake reached across the small space between them and took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and independence. "She did a remarkable job raising you. You're everything I could have hoped for in a daughter, and more than I deserve after missing so much of your life." "You didn't miss it by choice," Emma said firmly. "And you're here now, when I need you most." The pragmatic acceptance in her voice reminded Jake so strongly of Sarah that it took his breath away. Both women possessed that rare combination of strength and gentleness that made them capable of surviving anything while still maintaining their capacity for love and trust. "The men hunting me," Jake said, forcing himself to focus on their immediate danger. "They're not going to stop just because I've found you. If anything, discovering our connection will make you a target too." Emma nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. "Then we face them together. I've been alone for most of my life, but I don't have to be anymore. Emma, you don't understand the kind of people we're dealing with. They've been patient enough to hunt me for 20 years. They have resources, connections, probably men in every major town between here and the Mexican border. And I have something they don't," Emma replied with quiet confidence. "What's that?" "Her father, who spent 2 decades learning how to disappear in country they don't understand." She stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin, plus a few advantages of my own. From the chest, Emma withdrew items that made Jake's eyebrows rise. A well-maintained Winchester rifle, a Colt revolver that looked like it had seen careful use, and a collection of ammunition that spoke of someone who took their personal security seriously. "Ruth was married to a cavalry sergeant before she came to these mountains," Emma explained, checking the rifle's action with practiced ease. "She taught me to shoot when I was 8. Said a woman alone needed to be able to protect herself from both animal and human predators." Jake watched his daughter handle the weapons with competent familiarity, feeling a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride that she was so capable and self-reliant, sorrow that circumstances had forced her to develop such skills at such a young age. "There's something else," Emma said, returning to the chest. She withdrew a small leather pouch and emptied its contents onto the table. Gold nuggets, each about the size of a child's fingernail, caught the firelight and gleamed with warm promise. "Where did you get these?" "Mother found them in the creek behind our original cabin. Ruth said there might be more where they came from, but she also said gold brought the wrong kind of attention." Emma scooped the nuggets back into the pouch. "I've been saving them for an emergency." Jake stared at the pouch, understanding dawning in his mind. "You think this might be connected to why those men are hunting me?" "I think 20 years is a long time to hold a grudge, unless there's profit involved." Emma's green eyes were bright with intelligence. "And I think men with resources don't usually chase ghosts in the mountains, unless they believe those. Ghosts know something valuable." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture that made Jake's blood run cold. If Emma was right, then his enemies weren't just trying to silence him. They were after something they believed he possessed. Something valuable enough to justify a 2-decade hunt. "We need to leave tonight," Jake said, standing with more energy than he'd shown since his recovery began. "If they're already asking questions in town, they'll be spreading out to search the area soon." Emma nodded and began efficiently packing their supplies. "Where do we go?" I know a place, Jake said, checking the loads and his own weapons. Somewhere we can hole up while we figure out exactly what these men want and how to give it to them permanently. As they prepared for their midnight departure, Jake found himself stealing glances at his daughter, still hardly believing the miracle of her existence. He had thought his life was ending when the poison coursed through his veins. Instead, it had brought him home to a family he'd never dared to hope for. Now he just had to keep them both alive long enough to enjoy it. 3 days into their journey through the high mountain passes, Emma discovered the military medal while reorganizing Jake's pack. The bronze star was wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, hidden beneath spare ammunition and dried meat. When she held it up to catch the morning light filtering through the pine canopy, Jake's expression shifted from surprise to something deeper, pain mixed with a pride he'd thought long buried. "You were decorated," Emma said, turning the medal over in her small hands. "This is a Medal of Honor." Jake accepted the medal when she handed it to him, his weathered fingers tracing the familiar weight. 3rd Colorado Cavalry under Colonel Chivington. Though I'm not proud of everything that unit did under his command. They had taken shelter in a natural cave high on Eagle's Ridge, a place Jake had discovered years earlier during his first winter in the mountains. The cave was deep enough to hide a small fire and positioned to give them a clear view of the approaches from 3 directions. Emma had proven to be an ideal traveling companion, uncomplaining about the harsh conditions, quick to learn the hand signals Jake used for silent communication, and possessed of an instinctive understanding of how to move through wilderness without leaving obvious trails. "Tell me about the war," Emma said, settling beside him on the flat rock that served as their makeshift seat. "Mother's journal mentioned that you served, but she never wrote details." Jake stared out at the vast expanse of snow-covered peaks, remembering a time when the world had seemed much simpler, when right and wrong were defined by uniform colors and flag allegiances. "I was 18 when I enlisted, full of patriotic fervor and romantic notions about glory in battle. The reality was considerably different." "How so?" "War strips away illusions quickly. You learn that brave men die just as easily as cowards, that victory often comes down to who has better supply lines rather than who has the righteousness of their cause." Jake's voice carried the weight of memories he rarely shared. "But there were moments when the cause was clear, when what we did mattered." Emma waited patiently, understanding that some stories needed time to emerge on their own. "This medal," Jake continued, hefting the bronze star, "was for an action at Glorieta Pass in New Mexico territory. Confederate forces were trying to capture Union supply depots, planning to use them as a staging ground for a larger offensive into Colorado. Our unit was tasked with delaying their advance until reinforcements could arrive. What happened? We were outnumbered 3-1, positioned in terrain that should have been indefensible. But we had something the Confederate forces didn't expect: detailed knowledge of every canyon, every water source, every game trail in a 50-mile radius." Jake smiled grimly. "Turns out all those years of hunting and tracking with my father had prepared me for unconventional warfare." Emma leaned forward, drawn into the story despite herself. Her father had always been larger than life in her imagination, but hearing concrete details of his past made him more real, more human. "I took a small detachment up through what the maps called impassable terrain. We spent 2 days moving through country that would challenge experienced mountain climbers, carrying enough explosives to bring down half a mountainside." Jake's eyes grew distant with memory. The Confederate supply train was moving through Miller's Canyon, confident they were beyond the reach of Union forces. "You ambushed them." "We brought the canyon walls down on top of them, destroyed 3 months' worth of supplies and equipment, captured their commanding officers, and scattered their forces so thoroughly it took them weeks to regroup." Jake turned the medal over in his hands. 27 men accomplished what a full regiment couldn't have managed through conventional tactics. Emma studied her father's profile, seeing something in his expression that hadn't been there before. "But that's not the whole story." Jake glanced at her, surprised by her perception. "You read people well. Mother always said that what people don't say is often more important than what they do say. What aren't you telling me about that medal? Jake was quiet for several minutes, wrestling with memories he'd never shared with anyone. The Confederate supply train wasn't just carrying military equipment. There were civilian wagons mixed in, families trying to reach relatives in Texas, people who had nothing to do with the war, but were traveling with the convoy for protection. Understanding dawned in Emma's eyes. They were caught in the rock slide. 17 civilians died that day, including 3 children. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. We had no way of knowing they were there. No intelligence suggesting non-combatants were traveling with the military convoy. But that doesn't change the fact that my actions killed innocent people. Emma reached over and covered his hand with hers, feeling the tension in his muscles. You were a soldier following orders in wartime. Those deaths aren't your fault. I've been telling myself that for 25 years. Some days I even believe it. Jake carefully rewrapped the medal in its oiled cloth. But it changed how I saw warfare, how I saw following orders without question. After Glorieta Pass, I started asking harder questions about the missions we were given. Is that what led to the trouble that made you leave the service? Jake nodded slowly. After the war ended, Colonel Chivington wanted to continue military actions against Native American tribes. Said it was necessary to protect white settlers and maintain order in the territory. But his methods, Jake shook his head. Let's just say they weren't compatible with the honor I thought I was serving. Emma waited, sensing there was more to the story. I refused to participate in what he called pacification raids, but what I knew were attacks on non-combatant villages. Made my objections known through proper military channels. Jake's laugh held no humor. That's when I learned that doing the right thing doesn't always protect you from the consequences. They court-martialed you. They tried to, but I had allies, other officers, who were equally uncomfortable with Chivington's methods. In the end, they offered me an honorable discharge in exchange for my silence about certain operations. Jake looked directly at Emma. I took the discharge and thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The men hunting you now, they're connected to what happened after the war. I believe so. Some of the people involved in those operations went on to positions of power and influence. My continued existence, especially with my knowledge of what really happened, represents a threat to their reputations and careers. Emma absorbed this information, fitting it together with what they'd already discovered. So when you stumbled onto evidence of their current illegal activities, they decided I needed to disappear permanently. Yes. The wanted poster, the false story about my death, all of it designed to discredit me in advance while isolating me from potential allies. The wind picked up outside their cave, whistling through the pine branches and reminding them both of their exposed position. Jake moved to the cave entrance and carefully scanned the approaches, his trained eyes searching for any sign of movement that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the mountains. We can't stay here much longer, he said, returning to their small fire. This cave is defensible, but it's also a trap if they manage to find us. Emma began repacking their supplies with practiced efficiency. Where do we go next? There's an old mining camp about 2 days north of here. Abandoned since the silver played out, but the buildings are still sound. More importantly, it's connected to a network of mine tunnels that honeycomb the entire mountainside. Jake checked his weapons one final time. If we can reach it, we'll have dozens of escape routes and defensive positions. And then, Emma asked, shouldering her pack with the ease of someone born to the mountains, then we stop running and start hunting. Jake's voice carried a hard edge that Emma had never heard before. I've spent 20 years letting these men dictate the terms of my life, but they made a mistake when they threatened you. Emma studied her father's face in the firelight, seeing the transformation from gentle protector to something far more dangerous. What kind of mistake? They gave me something worth fighting for again. Jake kicked dirt over their fire, plunging the cave into darkness, lit only by the grey morning light from the entrance. For 20 years, I've been content to hide, to avoid confrontation, to let sleeping dogs lie. But now they've involved my daughter in their schemes. As they prepared to leave the cave, Emma found herself both thrilled and terrified by the steel in her father's voice. She was about to see a side of Jake Morrison that few people had witnessed and lived to tell about, the decorated cavalry officer who could bring down mountains, the man whose reputation had kept dangerous people at bay for 2 decades. "Are you ready for this?" Jake asked, his dark eyes meeting hers in the dim light. Emma thought of her mother's journal, of the bracelet on her wrist, of the years she'd spent alone wondering about the father she'd never known. "I've been ready my whole life." The abandoned mining camp of Silver Creek sat like a ghost town against the stark mountainside. Its weathered buildings, testament to dreams that had turned to dust when the ore played out. Jake and Emma approached carefully through the pre-dawn darkness, moving with the synchronized precision they'd developed during their days on the trail together. The camp appeared deserted, but Jake's military training had taught him that appearances could be fatally deceptive. Emma paused behind a fallen pine tree, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. She had adapted to their nomadic existence with remarkable resilience, but Jake could see the strain in her movements, the careful way she conserved her energy. They both needed rest, hot food, and a defensible position where they could plan their next moves. "The assay office," Jake whispered, pointing to a sturdy stone building at the camp's center. "It was built to withstand dynamite and pickaxes. If we can secure it, we'll have a fortress." They moved through the abandoned streets like shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfare and keeping to the spaces between buildings. Most of the structures were wood-frame constructions that had suffered from years of mountain weather, their roofs sagging and walls warped. But the assay office stood solid and square, its thick stone walls and iron-shuttered windows promising security. Inside, they found evidence of the building's original purpose: heavy scales for weighing precious metals, a massive safe with its door hanging open, and charts showing the locations of various mining claims. But more importantly, they found supplies that previous travelers had cached there: canned goods, coffee, blankets, and ammunition. "Someone's been using this as a way station," Emma observed, examining the supplies. "Everything's organized, not scattered like it would be from scavenging." Jake nodded, his attention focused on the building's defensive possibilities. "Mountain men, probably. There's an unwritten code about places like this. Take what you need, leave what you can. Maintain the shelter for the next person who might need sanctuary." As Emma organized their temporary camp, Jake explored the network of mine tunnels that connected to the building's basement. The previous occupants had done considerable work to map the underground passages, creating a hand-drawn chart that showed exits scattered across several square miles of mountainous terrain. "It's perfect," Jake said, returning from his reconnaissance. "We have multiple escape routes, elevated defensive positions, and enough supplies to last weeks if necessary." Emma had managed to coax a small fire from the pot-bellied stove in the corner, filling the room with welcome warmth. She was heating water for coffee, a luxury they hadn't enjoyed since leaving her cabin. "What's our plan?" "We can't hide here forever." Jake settled into a wooden chair that had seen better days, studying the mine tunnel map while he organized his thoughts. "We need information. Who's hunting us? How many men they have? What they ultimately want. Right now, we're reacting instead of acting. How do we get that information without exposing ourselves?" "Carefully. And with help from people who owe me favors." Jake folded the map and tucked it into his jacket. "There's a man in Leadville, Marcus Webb, who used to run supplies to the remote mining camps. He hears everything that happens in the territory, and he's trustworthy." Emma poured coffee into 2 metal cups, the rich aroma filling the small space. "You think he'll help us?" "I saved his life during a blizzard 8 years ago. Found him half frozen in a snowbank after his horse had thrown him and wandered off." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring the first hot drink he'd had in days. "Marcus is the kind of man who pays his debts." "What do we tell him?" "As much of the truth as necessary. That we're being hunted by people with resources and long memories, and we need to know who they are before we can figure out how to stop them." Emma sat across from him, cupping her hands around the warm metal of her coffee cup. In the stove's glow, Jake could see Sarah in every line of her face, every gesture of her hands. The resemblance was so strong, it sometimes took his breath away. "There's something else we need to discuss," Emma said quietly. "Something I found in Mother's things before we left the cabin." She reached into her pack and withdrew a small item wrapped in silk cloth. When she unfolded it, Jake saw a simple gold ring, a wedding band worn smooth by years of handling. "Mother wore this every day," Emma said, holding the ring up to catch the firelight. "Ruth said she claimed to be a widow to explain my existence, but she never acted like a woman who'd lost her husband to death." Jake stared at the ring, his throat tightening with emotion. "She kept it all these years?" "It was in her jewelry box with a note." Emma unfolded a small piece of paper, her mother's familiar handwriting faded, but still legible. "It says, 'For the only man I'll ever love whenever he comes home.'" Jake took the ring with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of 20 years of faith and hope. Sarah had worn this ring as a symbol of their love, a tangible connection to the life they should have shared. The knowledge that she had died still believing in their future together was almost unbearable. "She never gave up on you," Emma said softly. "Even when everyone told her you were dead, even when practical considerations should have convinced her to move on with her life. She loved you until the very end." Jake slipped the ring onto his little finger, the only digit it would fit. The metal was warm from Emma's touch, and wearing it felt like a sacred promise to the woman who had borne his child and raised her with stories of a father who would someday return. "I failed her," Jake said, his voice thick with regret. "I should have found a way to come back, should have defied the danger and made sure she was safe. You did what you thought was right to protect us both. Mother understood that, and she never blamed you for the choice you made." Emma reached across the small space and squeezed his hand. "But now we have a chance to honor her memory by finishing what those men started 20 years ago." Jake looked up, seeing determination blazing in his daughter's eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean we stop running and start making them answer for the lives they've destroyed. For the years you lost with Mother, for the childhood I spent wondering about my father, for all the other people they've hurt in the name of protecting their secrets." The transformation in Emma's voice was remarkable. Gone was the gentle mountain girl who had nursed him back to health. In her place sat a young woman with steel in her spine and fire in her heart, Sarah's daughter in every respect, but with something harder, more dangerous, inherited from her father's side. "It won't be easy," Jake warned. "These are powerful people with unlimited resources and no scruples about how they eliminate threats. Then we'll have to be smarter, faster and more ruthless than they are." Emma's smile was sharp-edged and entirely humorless. "Besides, we have advantages they don't know about, such as they're hunting Jake Morrison, the mountain man. They have no idea that Jake Morrison has found his daughter, and they certainly don't know what she's capable of." Emma's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Mother may have taught me to heal, but Ruth taught me to fight. And I've had 16 years to get very, very good at surviving in hostile territory." Jake stared at his daughter, seeing Sarah's gentle wisdom combined with a capacity for calculated violence that was purely his own legacy. The men hunting them had no idea what they had awakened when they decided to involve Emma in their schemes. "All right," Jake said, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. "We stop running tomorrow, but we do this smart, and we do it together." "Together," Emma agreed, touching her cup to his. "The way it should have been from the beginning." Outside the stone walls of the assay office, the wind howled through the abandoned mining camp, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. But inside, father and daughter planned their campaign against enemies who had underestimated the power of family bonds. Forged in love and tempered by loss, Emma had been unusually quiet during their morning meal of hardtack and coffee, her attention focused on something she kept turning over in her hands. When Jake looked closer, he realized it was an envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with red wax that had cracked but never been broken. "I found this hidden in the bottom of Mother's jewelry box," Emma said. her voice uncertain for the first time since they'd started their journey together. I almost missed it. It was tucked behind the velvet lining, like she wanted to make sure it was safe, but also make sure it would someday be found. Jake set down his coffee cup, his attention entirely focused on the letter. The handwriting on the front was Sarah's, but the ink had faded to brown, suggesting the letter had been written years ago. His name was written across the front in her careful script, for Jake Morrison, if God wills that he should someday read these words. "How long have you known about this?" Jake asked. "I found it the night before we left the cabin, but I wasn't sure if I should give it to you. After what we discovered about our relationship, I thought maybe it was meant to stay private." Emma held the letter out to him with hands that trembled slightly. "But last night, thinking about everything that's happened, I realized that some secrets are meant to be shared." Jake accepted the letter with the reverence due to a sacred relic. The wax seal bore the imprint of a small flower, Sarah's personal mark, one he remembered from letters she'd written to him during their courtship. His hands shook as he carefully broke the seal and unfolded the pages within. The paper was of good quality, suggesting Sarah had saved her best stationery for this particular message. The ink, though faded, was still legible, and Jake recognized her careful handwriting immediately. He began to read aloud, his voice growing stronger as Sarah's words reached across 20 years of separation. "My dearest Jake, I'm writing this letter on the anniversary of the day I received word of your death. Though my heart refuses to believe the news is true. Emma is 2 years old now, a beautiful child with your dark eyes and stubborn chin, and I see you in every expression that crosses her face. I have tried to accept that you are gone, tried to mourn properly and move forward with the life that remains to me. But something deep in my soul insists that you are still alive somewhere, still fighting whatever battles drove you away from us. So I write this letter as an act of faith, trusting that someday you will return and need to know what happened after you left." Jake paused, his voice catching in his throat. Emma moved closer, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder as he continued reading. "First, you must know that I was carrying your child when you left. I discovered the pregnancy 2 weeks after your departure, and I confess that my first emotion was joy, so pure it took my breath away. We had created a life together, a living symbol of our love that would endure regardless of what dangers threatened us. I waited as long as I dared before telling my family, hoping you would return in time to marry me properly and give our child your name from the beginning. When months passed with no word, I was forced to confess my condition. As you might expect, my father's reaction was explosive." Jake's hands tightened on the paper. He remembered Sarah's father as a stern, unforgiving man who valued reputation above almost everything else. The thought of Sarah facing his wrath alone while carrying Jake's child filled him with retroactive fury and guilt. He demanded to know your whereabouts so he could force you to marry me immediately. When I explained that you had left on business and I didn't know when you would return, he declared that I had been abandoned by a scoundrel and that the child would bring nothing but shame to our family name. He gave me a choice: give up the baby for adoption to a family in another state, or leave his house forever and never contact the family again. I chose to leave, Jake. I could not abandon our child no matter the cost to myself. Ruth Henley, bless her soul, offered me shelter when she learned of my circumstances. She had lost her own husband in the war and understood what it meant to face the world alone. She brought Emma and me to her cabin in the mountains, where we could live quietly without the judgment of society. The letter continued for several more pages, detailing Sarah's life in the mountains, Emma's early years, and the gradual acceptance that Jake might indeed be dead. But it was the final paragraphs that hit Jake like physical blows. 3 months ago, a man came to see me. Well-dressed, with the manner of someone accustomed to authority, he claimed to be a government agent investigating war crimes from the Colorado Territory campaigns. He said your name had come up in connection with certain activities, and he wanted to know if I had any information about your whereabouts or your possessions from your military service. I told him truthfully that I hadn't seen you in years and believed you to be dead. He seemed satisfied with my answer, but something about his manner troubled me. There was a calculation in his questions, as if he was fishing for specific information rather than conducting a routine investigation. After he left, I began to wonder if the story of your death had been fabricated. If someone had wanted you to disappear, what better way than to convince those who loved you that you were gone forever? The thought both thrilled and terrified me. Thrilled that you might still be alive, terrified that you might be in terrible danger. So I write this letter as both confession and warning. If you are alive and someday return to find us, know that someone is still looking for you, still asking questions about your past. Know also that Emma exists and needs her father, regardless of the risks involved. I have loved you every day since you left, Jake Morrison, and I will love you every day until I draw my last breath. Our daughter is growing into a remarkable young woman who deserves to know the man who gave her such strength and courage. Come home to us if you can. We will be waiting. All my love always, Sarah P.S. I have enclosed a small map showing the location where Emma and I are living. If anything happens to me, she will need you more than ever. Jake finished reading in complete silence, the weight of Sarah's words settling over him like a physical burden. She had known, or at least suspected, that the reports of his death were false. She had waited for him, hoped for his return, even while building a life without him. Emma was crying quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks as she absorbed the full implications of her mother's letter. She never gave up hope, she whispered. Even when everyone told her she was fooling herself, she knew you were still alive. Jake folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking with emotion. The man she described, the one asking questions about me, that was 3 months before she died. According to the date on the letter, yes. Then they were already closing in, already narrowing their search. Jake's voice was grim. Sarah's death from consumption wasn't just tragic timing. It was convenient for people who wanted to eliminate any connections to my past. Emma looked up sharply. You think they killed her? I think they didn't have to. Consumption is a long, lingering death. If someone wanted to ensure she couldn't answer future questions about me, all they had to do was make sure she didn't receive proper medical treatment. The implications hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. If Jake was right, then Sarah had died not from natural causes, but from deliberate neglect. Another casualty in a war that had been raging for decades. There's something else, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something I never told anyone, not even Ruth. Jake waited, sensing that whatever Emma was about to reveal would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. The Winter Mother died. There was a man who came to the cabin several times. He claimed to be a doctor, said he'd heard there was illness in our area, and was offering his services to families who couldn't afford regular medical care. Emma's hands clenched into fists, but his treatments made Mother worse, not better. The medicines he gave her seemed to accelerate her decline rather than help her recover. Jake felt ice forming in his veins. Did you tell Ruth about this? I tried to, but I was only 4 years old. Ruth assumed I was confused about the sequence of events, that grief was making me imagine things. Emma met his eyes directly. But I remember, Father. I remember the way that man smiled when Mother grew weaker, the way he seemed pleased with her deteriorating condition. They murdered her, Jake said, the words carrying absolute certainty. They found our connection, eliminated the threat she represented, and made sure it looked like natural causes. Emma nodded, her tears now mixed with anger. Which means they've known about me all along. The daughter of Jake Morrison and Sarah Whitfield, raised in isolation where she couldn't ask inconvenient questions or attract unwanted attention. Jake stood abruptly, pacing to the window of the assay office. Outside, the abandoned mining camp looked even more desolate in the grey morning light, its empty buildings testament to dreams that had died hard deaths. He felt the same desolation in his soul, 20 years of careful hiding, 20 years of believing his sacrifice had protected the people he loved, only to discover that his enemies had found them anyway. "So what now?" Emma asked, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Jake turned back to his daughter, seeing Sarah's face, but also something harder, more dangerous, a look that promised retribution for decades of loss and pain. "Now we stop playing their game by their rules," Jake said, his voice carrying the cold edge of absolute determination. "They've taken everything from us already. We have nothing left to lose and everything to gain." Emma wiped her eyes and stood, moving to stand beside her father at the window. "What do you have in mind?" "We're going to hunt the hunters," Jake replied, his dark eyes reflecting a deadly promise. "And we're going to make sure they answer for every life they've destroyed in the name of protecting their secrets." The hand-drawn map Emma found tucked behind Sarah's letter was more than just a guide to hidden locations. It was a tactical masterpiece that revealed her mother had been far more than the simple mountain woman she'd appeared to be. The carefully marked positions showed defensive strongholds, supply caches, and escape routes spread across nearly 100 square miles of wilderness, all connected by game trails and mining paths that didn't appear on any official survey. Jake studied the map by lamplight, his respect for Sarah growing with each detail he absorbed. "Your mother was planning for a war she hoped would never come," he said, tracing a route that would take them through terrain so difficult their pursuers would need days to navigate what they could cover in hours. Emma leaned over his shoulder, her finger pointing to a symbol near the map's center. "What's this marking here?" "It looks like a house, but there's something written beneath it I can't make out." Jake squinted at the faded ink, then felt his breath catch in his throat. "It says, 'For Jay when he comes home.'" She marked the location of a cabin, Emma, a place she prepared specifically for my return. How could she have built a cabin without Ruth knowing about it? "Look at the location," Jake said, pointing to the surrounding topographical markers. "It's in Devil's Canyon, about 15 miles from where you were living. The canyon's been considered impassable since a rockslide blocked the main entrance back in '68, but your mother found another way in." Emma studied the route Sarah had marked, seeing the intelligence and foresight that had gone into the planning. She was creating a sanctuary where we could all be together safely, wasn't she? More than that. She was building a fortress. Jake's voice carried admiration and heartbreak in equal measure. "Look at these defensive positions, the overlapping fields of fire, the multiple escape routes. Your mother understood that if I ever did return, it would be with danger close behind." They spent the rest of the day preparing for what Jake knew would be their final journey together as hunted fugitives. From the supply cache in the assay office, they selected equipment for a campaign, rather than simple survival: extra ammunition, rope and climbing gear, tools for sabotage, and medical supplies for treating combat injuries. Emma proved to have inherited more than Sarah's intelligence and compassion. As she cleaned and checked her weapons, Jake saw the methodical precision of someone trained for violence. Her movements were economical and practiced, suggesting hours of instruction that went far beyond Ruth's basic self-defense lessons. "There's something I need to tell you about Ruth," Emma said, as if reading his thoughts. "She wasn't just a cavalry sergeant's widow. She was a scout for the Union Army during the war, one of the few women who served in that capacity." Jake looked up from his own preparations, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "What kind of scouting?" "Intelligence gathering, infiltration of Confederate positions, what they called special reconnaissance in the reports she showed me." Emma's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she packed her gear. "Ruth taught me more than shooting and wilderness survival, Father. She taught me how to think like a soldier." The revelation explained much about Emma's composure under pressure, her instinctive understanding of tactics and terrain. She had been raised by two remarkable women who had each contributed essential skills to her development: Sarah's wisdom and healing knowledge, Ruth's military expertise and combat training. "How much did Ruth tell you about your mother's background?" Jake asked, more than I initially realized. Ruth said Mother had skills that seemed unusual for a preacher's daughter. Too much knowledge of weapons and tactics, too comfortable with the idea of using violence when necessary. Emma met his eyes directly. Ruth suspected that Mother's family background wasn't what she claimed it to be. Jake felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. Your grandfather wasn't really a preacher, was he? Ruth thought he might have been military intelligence, possibly involved in irregular warfare during the border conflicts before the Civil War. Emma's voice carried the weight of long-held secrets finally being revealed. That would explain why Mother knew so much about defensive planning and why she was able to prepare for threats that might someday come looking for you. The implications were staggering. Sarah hadn't been an innocent civilian caught up in Jake's dangerous past. She had been a trained operative in her own right. Someone who understood the world of secrets and violence that had claimed so many lives. Her relationship with Jake hadn't been a romantic accident, but a meeting between two people who lived in the shadows of official history. So when she chose to have your child and wait for your return, Jake said slowly, she was making a tactical decision as well as an emotional one. She was betting that together you could protect your family from threats that neither of you could handle alone. Emma shouldered her pack and checked her weapons one final time. And now we get to find out if she was right. They left the mining camp under cover of darkness, following Sarah's mapped route through terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers in daylight. Emma moved through the darkness with sure-footed confidence, her training evident in every step. Jake found himself constantly impressed by his daughter's capabilities while simultaneously mourning the childhood she'd never had. The journey to Devil's Canyon took them through some of the most spectacular and dangerous country in the Colorado Territory. They crossed knife-edge ridges where a single misstep would mean a 1,000-foot fall, traversed snowfields that could avalanche at the slightest disturbance, and navigated through forests so thick that noon looked like twilight beneath the canopy. But Emma's map proved accurate in every detail. Hidden supply caches appeared exactly where marked, containing food, ammunition, and fresh clothing that Sarah had positioned years earlier. Alternative routes around impassable obstacles led them safely past dangers that would have stopped less prepared travelers. On their second night, as they sheltered in a cave marked on Sarah's map, Emma finally asked the question that had been building between them since they'd started their journey. What happens after we reach Mother's cabin? What's our endgame here, Father? Jake stared into their small fire, watching the flames dance across the cave walls. We make them come to us on our terms, in terrain we know and they don't, and then we end this permanently. You mean we kill them, if necessary? Jake's voice was steady, matter of fact. These people murdered your mother, Emma. They've spent 20 years destroying lives to protect their secrets. They're not going to stop because we ask nicely. Emma nodded, accepting the reality of their situation with the same practical wisdom she'd shown throughout their ordeal. How many do you think there are? Hard to say. The man who questioned your mother was probably the leader, someone with authority and resources. He'll have hired guns, professionals who know their business. My guess is we're looking at between 4 and 8 men, all of them dangerous. Those aren't terrible odds. Jake looked at his 16-year-old daughter, seeing steel in her green eyes that would have been intimidating in a grown man. No, they're not. Especially considering the advantages we have, such as, we know the terrain. We choose the battlefield. We have surprise, since they have no idea we've found each other or that we're done running. Jake's voice carried the confidence of a man who had spent decades learning how to survive against impossible odds. Most importantly, we're fighting for something they can't understand. Family. On their 3rd day of travel, they finally reached Devil's Canyon. The entrance Sarah had found was barely wide enough for a single person, hidden behind a screen of mountain laurel that made it invisible from more than 10 feet away. Inside, the canyon opened into a natural amphitheater, surrounded by walls so steep they seemed to touch the sky. The cabin sat in a clearing at the canyon's heart, positioned to command views of all approaches while remaining invisible from outside the canyon walls. It was larger than Jake had expected, built with the same military precision evident in Sarah's planning. Heavy log construction, gun ports disguised as windows, and what appeared to be multiple defensive positions showed that Sarah had prepared for siege warfare. "She built this for us," Emma said quietly, running her hands along the smooth-hewn logs of the cabin's walls. "A place where we could be a family without fear." Jake examined the defensive positions, seeing professional military engineering in their design. "Your mother was remarkable, Emma. She created something here that could withstand anything short of artillery bombardment." Inside, they found supplies that had been maintained and refreshed over the years, evidence that Sarah had visited regularly, keeping their potential refuge ready for the day it might be needed. Food stores, ammunition, medical supplies, and personal items suggested she had planned for an extended siege if necessary. But it was the personal touches that brought tears to Jake's eyes. Photographs of Emma at various ages, carefully preserved clothing in his size, and books she knew he enjoyed, all evidence of a woman who had never stopped believing in their future together. "There's something else," Emma said, opening a wooden chest near the fireplace. Inside were weapons and equipment that would have impressed a military quartermaster. Rifles, pistols, explosives, and specialized gear for mountain warfare. Jake examined the arsenal with professional appreciation. Where did she get all this? Some of it was Ruth's from her military service, but I think Mother had her own sources. Emma held up a document from the bottom of the chest. "Look at this." It was a letter of credit from a Denver bank, dated just months before Sarah's death, authorizing the transfer of a substantial sum of money to purchase sporting goods and camping equipment. The amount was far more than a simple mountain woman could have afforded. She was funded by someone, Jake realized. Someone with deep pockets who wanted to make sure she had everything necessary to survive a war, or someone who knew that war was coming and wanted to make sure the right people were prepared to fight it. Emma's voice carried a new understanding of their situation. "Father, what if we're not the only ones who've been preparing for this confrontation? What if Mother was part of something larger?" Jake stared at the evidence before them, realizing that their simple story of love and loss was actually part of a much more complex tale of secret alliances and hidden warfare. "Then we're about to find out just how deep this conspiracy goes," he said, checking the loads in his weapons, "and whether your mother's preparations were enough to see us through to the end." Outside Devil's Canyon, their enemies were closing in, following trails that would eventually lead them to the confrontation Sarah had spent years preparing for. Inside the hidden fortress she had created, father and daughter made their final preparations for a battle that would determine not just their survival, but the truth behind decades of secrets and lies. Jake's Colt 45 felt like an old friend in his hand as he checked the cylinder one final time, the familiar weight reminding him of countless confrontations over the past 2 decades. The weapon had been his constant companion through every danger he'd faced, and now it would help him protect the most precious thing he'd ever found, his daughter. Emma crouched beside the cabin's easternmost gun port, her Winchester rifle trained on the narrow canyon entrance they'd used to reach their sanctuary. Her breathing was controlled and steady, showing none of the nervousness Jake might have expected from someone facing their first real combat. Instead, she exhibited the calm focus of a veteran preparing for battle. "Movement at the North Ridge," Emma whispered, never taking her eyes from her scope. 3 men, advancing in tactical formation. "They know what they're doing." Jake moved to the window overlooking the canyon's main approaches, his own rifle ready. Through the morning mist, he could make out figures positioned on the rim above them, professionals who had found their hiding place with disturbing efficiency. "How many do you count total?" he asked, scanning the terrain for additional threats. "At least 6, maybe 8. They've got us surrounded, but they're being cautious about the approach." Emma's voice carried the analytical tone of someone trained to assess tactical situations. "Ruth always said the most dangerous enemies are the ones who take their time." Jake felt a surge of pride mixed with concern as he watched his daughter's professional competence. In 3 days, she had transformed from a gentle mountain girl into a formidable soldier. ready to defend their position against odds that would daunt experienced fighters. "There," Emma said, her rifle shifting to track a new target. The man in the expensive coat, positioned behind the large boulder on the eastern slope. "That's him, isn't it? The one who questioned Mother." Jake followed her line of sight and felt his blood turn cold. Even at this distance, he recognized Marcus Dalton, older now, grayer, but still carrying himself with the arrogant authority Jake remembered from their confrontation 20 years earlier. The man who had orchestrated his frame-up, who had destroyed his reputation and driven him into exile, who had ultimately been responsible for Sarah's death. "That's him," Jake confirmed, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "Marcus Dalton, the man who's been hunting us all these years. He's got a rifle trained on our position, but he's not shooting. That means he still wants something from us." Emma adjusted her own aim, keeping Dalton in her sights. "Question is, do we give him the chance to ask for it?" Jake considered their options, weighing decades of tactical experience against the fury that demanded immediate action. Dalton had taken everything from him, his reputation, his freedom, his chance at a life with Sarah. Now the man had the audacity to threaten Emma as well. "We wait," Jake decided. "Let him make the first move. If he wants to talk, we'll listen. But the moment he or his men make any aggressive action, we end it," Emma finished, her voice carrying the same deadly certainty that had made Jake's reputation in these mountains. A white cloth appeared on the end of a rifle barrel, waved from behind Dalton's position. The universal signal for parley, though Jake knew better than to trust the honor of men who murdered innocent women and children. "Jake Morrison!" Dalton's voice echoed across the canyon, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone walls. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Jake moved to the cabin's front door but remained behind cover. "We're talking now, Dalton. Say what you came to say. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. I have information you need, and you have something that belongs to me. Perhaps we can reach an understanding." Emma glanced at her father, seeing the skeptical expression on his weathered face. What could he possibly want that would be worth a 20-year hunt? "Maps," Jake realized, the pieces finally clicking together. "The mine survey maps from the Glorieta Pass region. He thinks I still have them." During his final mission as a cavalry officer, Jake had been tasked with securing Confederate supply routes through New Mexico territory. In the process, he discovered detailed geological surveys showing previously unknown gold and silver, deposits throughout the region, maps that would be worth millions to anyone. With the resources to develop the claims, "You think that's what this is really about?" Emma asked. "Not revenge, not covering up war crimes, but money?" "With men like Dalton, it's always about money eventually," Jake called out toward the canyon rim. "The maps were destroyed 20 years ago, Marcus. Whatever fortune you thought you could steal from those claims is long gone." "I don't believe you," Dalton's voice carried across the distance. "And even if they were destroyed, you remember every detail, don't you, Morrison? That legendary memory of yours that made you such an effective scout." Jake felt Emma's questioning gaze and nodded grimly. It was true. He did remember the locations, could draw accurate reproductions of those maps from memory if necessary. The knowledge had been both blessing and curse, keeping him valuable enough to hunt, but dangerous enough to kill. "Last chance, Morrison. Send out the girl and surrender yourself. I give you my word, you'll both be treated fairly." Emma's snort of derision was audible even to Jake. His word. "The word of a man who had my mother murdered." "What's your answer, Jake?" Dalton called. Jake stepped into the cabin's doorway, making himself visible to the men positioned around the canyon rim. His Colt .45 hung ready at his side, and his voice carried clearly in the mountain air. "My answer is the same as it was 20 years ago, Marcus. Go to hell." The first shot came from the northern ridge, splintering wood inches from Jake's head as he dove back into cover. Emma's Winchester cracked in response, her bullet sparking off stone near the muzzle flash. "So much for negotiation," she said, working the rifle's lever action smoothly. "Now we do this the hard way." Jake moved to his chosen firing position, feeling the familiar calm that had carried him through dozens of similar situations. The transformation from peaceful mountain man to deadly warrior was complete, awakened by the need to protect his daughter from the monsters of his past. "Remember what I taught you about conserving ammunition," he told Emma, as bullets began striking the cabin walls with increasing frequency. "Make every shot count. We need to even the odds before they decide to rush us." Emma's next shot was followed by a cry of pain from the eastern slope, confirming her marksmanship under combat conditions. "That's one down. How many more do you think?" "Enough to make this interesting," Jake replied, his own rifle finding a target among the attackers. The familiar weight of the Colt at his side was reassuring, a reminder of all the battles he'd survived and all the reasons he had to survive this one, outside. Marcus Dalton's voice could be heard shouting orders to his remaining men, repositioning them for what would undoubtedly be a coordinated assault on their position. But inside Sarah's carefully prepared fortress, father and daughter stood ready to prove that some families were worth fighting for. No matter what the cost, the battle raged for 2 hours before Marcus Dalton made his fatal mistake. His professional gunman had proven skilled and cautious, keeping Jake and Emma pinned down while gradually closing the distance to their canyon fortress. But as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Devil's Canyon, Dalton's patience finally cracked under the pressure of mounting casualties. Emma had proven herself a deadly accurate shot, her Winchester claiming 2 more of Dalton's men when they exposed themselves trying to reach better positions. Jake's methodical marksmanship had wounded at least 1 additional attacker, forcing the survivors to take cover behind increasingly inadequate shelter. "They're getting desperate," Emma observed, reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency. "That last rush was poorly coordinated. They're losing discipline." Jake nodded, recognizing the signs of an enemy force beginning to unravel under sustained pressure. "Dalton's not a field commander. He's used to having other people do his fighting for him. When things go wrong, he doesn't know how to adapt." As if summoned by Jake's words, Dalton's voice echoed across the canyon once again, but this time it carried the harsh edge of a man whose careful plans were falling apart. "This is your last warning, Morrison. I have enough dynamite to bring down half this canyon. Surrender now, or I'll bury you both under a mountain of rock." Emma looked at her father questioningly. Is he bluffing? Jake considered the threat, weighing what he knew about Dalton's resources and desperation. Probably not entirely, but dynamite is a double-edged weapon in terrain like this. If he brings down the canyon walls, he risks burying himself and his men along with us. Plus, Emma added with a grim smile, Mother designed this place to withstand explosives. She learned from the best military engineers of her generation. The cabin's construction bore out Emma's confidence. The thick log walls were reinforced with stone and earth, positioned to deflect rather than absorb explosive force. Underground root cellars provided additional protection, and multiple escape routes through the mine tunnels offered alternatives if the main structure became untenable. But Dalton's next action proved that desperation had overcome whatever tactical judgment he might have possessed. The first explosion came from the canyon's northern rim, a massive detonation that sent tons of rock cascading into the valley below. The sound was deafening, and the ground shook beneath their feet like an earthquake. "He's actually doing it," Emma said, steadying herself against the cabin wall. "He's trying to seal us in." Jake moved to assess the damage, seeing that Dalton's first blast had indeed blocked one of the canyon's access routes. But the explosion had also revealed the fatal flaw in the plan. Dalton and his remaining men were positioned on the same unstable rock formations they were trying to destroy. "Look there." Jake pointed toward the eastern slope. "See how that ledge is cracked now? One more blast like that, and it'll take down everything above it, including our friend Marcus." Emma followed his gaze and smiled with predatory satisfaction. "So we help him along with his demolition project." She was already moving toward the wooden chest where Sarah had stored her most specialized equipment. From within, she withdrew what appeared to be mining charges, dynamite sticks prepared for precision blasting rather than mass destruction. Mother was thorough in her preparations, Emma explained, examining the charges with professional interest. Ruth taught me about explosives during our winter lessons. Said a good soldier needed to know how to both use and defend against them. Jake watched his daughter handle the dynamite with competent care, feeling another surge of pride tempered by amazement at the woman Sarah and Ruth had shaped from his genetic contribution. "What do you have in mind?" "That ledge Dalton's positioned on extends back into the mountain about 50 feet. If we can place charges at the right structural points, the whole formation will collapse into the canyon." Emma's eyes gleamed with tactical calculation. "We let him blow himself up with his own dynamite." Jake studied the geology of the canyon walls, seeing the fault lines and stress points Emma had identified. Sarah's choice of location had been masterful, a natural fortress that could be turned into a trap for anyone foolish enough to attack it directly. "It's risky," Jake warned. "We'll have to get within 50 yards of their position to place the charges effectively. That means leaving our cover and exposing ourselves to their fire. Not if we use the mine tunnels. Look at Mother's map. There's a passage that comes up right behind their position." Emma was already gathering the equipment they would need. "We go underground, place the charges and retreat before they know what's happening." The plan was audacious and dangerous, but it offered their best chance of ending the confrontation decisively. Jake found himself nodding slowly, recognizing the tactical brilliance that combined Sarah's engineering knowledge with Ruth's military expertise. "All right," he decided, "but we do this together. I'm not losing you after just finding you." Emma smiled, and for a moment Jake saw Sarah's gentle joy shining through their daughter's warrior competence. "Together, father." The way it should have been from the beginning. They gathered their gear quickly, including Dalton's confession, a detailed written statement Emma had discovered among Sarah's papers, documenting his war crimes and the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. Whether they survived the next hour or not, the truth would finally see daylight. Outside, Marcus Dalton was preparing his final gambit, unaware that his own explosives were about to become the instruments of his destruction. The hunt that had lasted 20 years was finally approaching its end, with the hunters about to become the hunted in the most permanent way possible. The photographer in Leadville had insisted on taking 3 portraits, claiming that the afternoon light was perfect for capturing what he called the dignity of frontier families. Jake stood behind Emma's chair, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, both of them dressed in the finest clothes they could purchase in the mining town's general store. It had been 6 weeks since Devil's Canyon, 6 weeks since Marcus Dalton's own dynamite had brought down the eastern ledge and ended a 20-year hunt in the most final way possible. The confession they'd found among Sarah's papers had cleared Jake's name completely, revealing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. 3 men had already been arrested and more indictments were expected. "Hold still now," the photographer instructed, disappearing beneath his black cloth. "This will be the first official portrait of the Morrison family." Emma smiled at the words, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the silver bracelet on her wrist, the same bracelet Jake had made for Sarah so many years ago. She wore it every day now, not as a memento of loss, but as a symbol of love's enduring power to bring families together across impossible distances. The flash powder exploded with a brilliant flare, capturing the image for posterity. When they were finished, Jake purchased copies to be sent to the few friends who had stood by him during his exile, proof that some stories do have happy endings, even when all hope seems lost. "What now, Father?" Emma asked as they walked through Leadville's bustling streets. The town was thriving, its silver mines producing wealth that drew people from all over the world. But neither Jake nor Emma felt the pull of civilization after so many years in the wilderness. "That depends on what you want," Jake replied, pausing to watch a freight wagon loaded with mining equipment navigate the crowded thoroughfare. "We have options now. The territorial governor has offered me a position as a special investigator, helping to root out corruption in the mining camps. The pay would be good and we could afford a house in town." Emma considered this, but Jake could see the answer in her eyes before she spoke. I spent my whole life in the mountains, Father. The city feels cramped. Too many people, too many rules, too much noise. Jake smiled, feeling the same restless energy that always came over him when he spent too much time around crowds and buildings. I was hoping you'd say that, because I have a better idea. They walked to the edge of town, where the mountains rose in majestic splendor toward the western sky. The peaks were snow-covered even in late spring, promising cool summers and the kind of pristine beauty that existed nowhere else on Earth. There's a valley about 30 miles northwest of here, Jake said, pointing toward the distant ranges. I found it years ago during a survey expedition. It's got everything we'd need. Fresh water, good hunting, timber for building, and isolation from anyone who might want to bother us. Emma followed his gaze, her green eyes bright with interest. You want us to homestead? I want us to build the life your mother dreamed of. A place where we can be a family without looking over our shoulders, where we can honor her memory by living the kind of life she would have wanted for us. Jake's voice carried the warmth of dreams, finally within reach. What do you think? Emma's answer came in the form of an embrace, her arms wrapping around her father's waist with the fierce joy of someone who had found exactly what she'd been searching for without knowing it. I think Mother would be proud of us, she said, her voice muffled against his chest. I think she'd be happy to know that her faith was rewarded, that the love she felt for you brought us together in the end. Jake held his daughter close, feeling the rightness of the moment settle into his bones like warmth from a good fire. After 20 years of exile and loneliness, after decades of believing he was destined to live and die alone, he had found his way home to family and love. That evening, in their hotel room overlooking Leadville's main street, Emma opened her mother's journal one final time. She had been saving the last entry, wanting to read Sarah's final words when their story had reached its proper conclusion. Listen to this, Father, Emma said, her voice steady but emotional. It's dated just 2 weeks before Mother died. She read aloud in the lamplight. Emma grows more beautiful each day, and more like her father in ways that both comfort and worry me. She has his stubborn streak, his fierce loyalty, and his capacity for love that runs deeper than mountain streams. If something happens to me, I pray that somehow Jake will find her and discover the treasure he left behind when circumstances forced him away. I have done everything I can to prepare for the dangers that may someday come looking for them both. The cabin in Devil's Canyon is ready, supplied and fortified for any siege. The weapons are cleaned and loaded, the escape routes mapped and provisioned. If my death brings Jake home to our daughter, then perhaps it will not have been in vain. I go to my rest with no regrets, knowing that I loved the finest man I ever met, and bore his child in a world that did not always welcome such blessings. Emma will carry the best of both of us forward into whatever future awaits. And if there is justice in heaven or on earth, that future will include the reunion I have dreamed of for so many years. Emma closed the journal with gentle finality. She knew, didn't she? She knew that her death would somehow bring us together. Jake nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that tightened his throat. Sarah's love had transcended death itself, reaching across the years to guide him home to the daughter he'd never known existed. The next morning, they purchased supplies for their journey into the wilderness, not as fugitives this time, but as a family preparing to build their life together. Jake had been offered his freedom by powerful men who wanted to buy his silence, but he had chosen something far more valuable, the chance to be the father Emma deserved and the man Sarah had always believed him to be. As they rode out of Leadville toward the mountains that had sheltered them both, Jake Morrison felt the weight of 20 years lift from his shoulders. The hunt was over, the secrets revealed, the family reunited. Ahead lay the valley where they would build their home, where Emma could tend her gardens and Jake could teach her the advanced skills that would keep them both safe in the years to come. Behind them, the town grew smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vast wilderness that had given them sanctuary and brought them together. They rode toward their future as father and daughter, carrying Sarah's memory and love with them into whatever adventures awaited in the untamed mountains of Colorado territory. The circle was complete, the promise fulfilled, the family finally whole.